Welcome to the second episode of Quantum Podcast with Jay Shah. I'm your host, Jay, a quantum machine learning researcher. Today we have with us Dr. Robert S. Sutor. He's a PhD in mathematics from Princeton University. In his 40 years with IBM, he has played some crucial roles in different technologies like AI, blockchain, and quantum computing. He's also the adjunct associate professor from the Department of Computer Science and Engineering at University at Buffalo. He's the author of the book Dancing with Qubits. In this podcast, we will be talking about generative AI, explainable AI, quantum careers, and a lot more. Yeah. So thanks, Robert, for joining us today and for sharing your views with the community. The very first question I have is what's your story of quantum computing and how you got into this
Sure.
technology?
Well, I have to say I was with IBM for many years. And the reason why that's relevant, so I'm a mathematician by training. I was an undergraduate at Harvard and PhD from Princeton. And I spent much of my IBM career in the math department in IBM research, specifically in the corporate research headquarters in Yorktown Heights, New York. I was in research 2 times, and the second time I came back to lead the math department. And I noticed there was something very interesting going on at the other end of the building. And that is people were building a quantum computer. And I knew absolutely nothing about quantum computing, quantum computers. I was in the math department. Those people at the other end of the building were physicists, right? And, I would see them in the lunchroom, but that I didn't talk to them. Right? But as it happened, we had a reorganization. And that group and my group reported to the same person. And so I was then sitting in meetings with these people, hearing what they were doing. And I thought this was really pretty interesting. And as I learned more about quantum, there was clearly a lot of mathematics involved. And that, in fact, leads up to when we talk about the book. When I was looking for materials to learn about quantum computing, I was thinking, okay, I have a doctorate in math. I know some math. There should be a book
Yes.
for people like me. And there wasn't a book for people like me, And so ultimately I decided to write a book. So that was my way into quantum, by physically becoming part of the organization eventually, but then also deciding to write a book to help other people learn it.
Yeah. So I already have the book here
Very
with
good.
me.
Okay. Extra credit
Yeah.
there. I,
So
I have one
I
over
mean,
there, too, my little display.
yeah. So I mean, I've gone through the book and I love the book, the way it builds
Thank you.
from the math perspective, and I really loved it. But as the author, how would you say how can reader get the best out of this book and who's the target audience?
And this book that we both showed is the second edition, just to be clear. I
Yeah.
started the first edition in the summer of 2018, and it was published late in 2019. And then I started the second edition about a year and a half ago, and it was published in March. Well, as I stated, first of all, you know, there wasn't a book for people like me. And what I really meant was people who fundamentally come from some sort of mathematical background, not physics. So I am not assuming that you went to university and took many years of physics and are really expert on quantum mechanics and things like this. Um, but also, there are a lot of people who like math, who took math in high school, who took math in university courses, maybe even people who did things like computational biology, right? Economics, that they may have concentrated or majored in subjects that involved a lot of math. But, then life happens. Maybe you don't end up keep doing a lot of math. Well, quantum computing comes on the scene, and all of a sudden there's math. And people are saying, do I remember all this math? Do I have to go back and take a class on the math and things like this? So I decided to approach this from perspectives of the first word to think about is relax. Don't be afraid of the math. I'm going to go back and tell you all the math you need to know. And we're going to do this very carefully. We're going to go back to what you learned probably when you were 16 years old. And people might say, oh, I don't want to cover that. That's obvious, right? Okay, but I teach you things you didn't know, right? And so I slowly build up, for example, the numbers. We go from integers to rational numbers to the real numbers to the complex numbers. And in particular, complex numbers are required for quantum. And the way a lot of people approach this is, well, you've got the regular numbers and you throw in the square root of -1 and you have the complex numbers and let's just keep going. And people are saying, why would I ever possibly want to do that? So I try to bring people along in a comfortable way, remind them what they once knew, teach them things that maybe they didn't know, and in that way go through complex numbers, probability, and linear algebra, vectors and matrices, so we can really get started on quantum computing. So there's this notion of relax, comfortable, don't worry. You'll learn what you need to know.
Yeah, I mean, that's something really important because quantum computing is such a vast subject. You can really get lost if
Mhm.
you don't pick the right resources. Yeah. And I mean, you are someone who has had this extensive career of 40 years
Mhm.
with all of these different technologies. And I personally come from the quantum machine learning background, quantum AI background. So how you think these two technologies that are growing at the same period of time, how can they complement each other?
That's it's a very interesting consideration, and of course, machine learning, AI, even more so, generative AI, right? It's a big thing now, right? Everybody's talking about it. That's a lot of money is flowing into it, and everybody wants to do AI somehow, some way. But to do AI right, you need a lot of computational power. You really do. There's some small problems we can do run of the mill, and by small, I mean less than a gigabyte of data. That's small right now. When we think about AI, ultimately it comes down to finding patterns, really, and then doing something with those patterns. Okay, I found a pattern in training, and then in the inference stage, I'm taking advantage of that. But it requires a lot of computation, and many of the different techniques are just about that, about understanding how the patterns are coming about, how I can build up new ones, and so forth. So a lot of people think, well, hey, quantum computing, right? Quantum computing will solve these really big problems. But for AI, there's this problem, a huge problem, and it's called the input problem. Today's quantum computers are small, they're tiny, and we need, for example, hundreds of thousands of qubits. And the biggest experimental system was by IBM at a little more than 1,100. But even more to the point is that these qubits, the quantum bit, are not error corrected. So, which means that the things that hold the information, the qubit, slowly become chaotic. That is, they start losing the values you put in them. And ultimately, it's just garbage, right? So, you load some data, and then you load more data, but the first data starts getting a little, errors, and you load more data, and the first and the second start getting a little bit. You cannot load much data into today's quantum computers. Now, there are very few serious AI problems on a little bit of data that you would possibly need a quantum computer. So today, what I would call QML, quantum machine learning, quantum AI, is only research. It is not in production. So people are looking at algorithms, maybe ways that we might be able to use it a little bit sooner than later, or understanding the right research pathways for algorithms. But there's no advantage now. And I would also say that it's probably going to be one of the last areas that quantum really becomes useful for, fundamentally because of this data problem. Now, if I may, let me turn it around a little bit. So that was quantum for AI. But what about AI for quantum?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, now that becomes more interesting. So, as an example, I mentioned that these qubits start getting more and more errors. Well, if we can understand the error model and start using machine learning to reduce the errors in some way, well, that's good. There's less error correction. So, in the short term, machine learning for quantum will be much more useful than quantum for machine learning.
All right. Yeah. Yeah, that was insightful for me as quantum AI researcher. And so you just mentioned that quantum AI will probably the last area to benefit. So what would be some of the first areas that would benefit from
So,
quantum?
there are really three areas, and this comes from really what we call a theoretical computer science perspective. A quantum computer, although it is Turing complete and so forth, it's not really just a general replacement or good tool for just any type of hard problem. There are roughly three classes of hard problems. So the first problem is to simulate physical processes like quantum chemistry. And this makes sense, right? So quantum chemistry is built on quantum mechanics. Quantum computing is built on quantum mechanics. So you have the same general notions. And so understanding molecular reactions and so forth, right? Now, the dream is always to understand protein folding, right? And I don't think a lot of people actually know all the applications of protein folding, but it sounds big, right? We may see some things there or approximations to what we can do. So it's these notions of simulating chemistry, simulating physical reactions because of this more direct comparison, quantum to quantum. The second area is related to just math, really. Quantum computers, you do linear algebra. The fundamental mathematics are these very large matrices, right, of particular types, right, unitary matrices, vectors, and so forth. And so if you've got math in the right format or can get it that way, you can use a quantum computer as a very good big linear algebra calculator. And so this is why, in fact, we think there'll be some of the AI or the machine learning applications, because underneath all the fancy AI, it's math. It's linear math,
It's
but it's
math.
math, right? You can't directly translate necessarily, for example, a traditional classical neural network to quantum. You have to come up with an analog, but maybe we can do some things. There's some at this point fairly old work already on quantum on solving systems of linear equations, which if people are familiar with that comes up. That's a standard tool. So under very special conditions. The first area was use quantum to simulate quantum physical processes. The second one was use it as a great linear algebra calculator. And then the third one is understanding that quantum at its core is probabilistic, right? It's not deterministic. It doesn't always produce the same result. And by the way, this drove Einstein absolutely crazy. This is why, he has this famous quote, which isn't quite exactly what he said, but God doesn't play dice, right? Throw
Doesn't throw
dice, right?
dice. Yeah,
And that's what it means is that he felt that if you start in one place and do something and then do something, you always end up at the same final. Famously, Stephen Hawking many decades later said that all evidence to the contrary, it seems that God plays dice every possible moment. And here, just to be clear, neither one of them were being especially religious. They were just talking about some overall, right, whatever is running the show, right, so to speak, here. And because it's probabilistic nature, we can do this for some types of optimization problems. Monte Carlo optimization, which is probabilistic, quantum random walks, and things like that. So those are generally the three areas. I will say, just as kind of an interesting other thing, I mentioned AI, linear algebra. There are areas like computational fluid dynamics, which also use a lot of matrices and things like this. So there are engineering applications. So don't think of it as a general, any hard problem. We tend to look for applications in one of those three areas.
okay. I mean, one of the questions that I have is that, like a general problem with classical AI is the interpretability part, the explainable AI. And if you see in the community, especially Quantinuum, I would say they are exploring this explainable AI with quantum
Hmm.
computing. So, do you see any promise there? Or
I'm not absolutely familiar with what they're doing. I do know they had a recent announcement about that. And here the problem. I mean, just to expand, if your audience is primarily quantum, you don't just want your AI system to give you an answer. You'd like to say, well, why did you come up with that answer? And that's not always easy, right? It's sometimes called explainability, transparency, things like this. And the reason why you would like to know is maybe, was there bias inserted somewhere, right? So you'd like to be able to track back. There are a lot of deep mathematical computations. I mean, billions of computations that get involved with this. So I think it's certainly a goal. Part of the reasons is probability is involved. Well, we could have done this or this, but we told you this, right? So it's good to know, but I would just put it under the general headlines of transparency. Don't just surprise me. I need to be able to somehow verify your thinking and so forth. There's so much mathematical computation that's not necessarily easy to do. If you forget that part, now I'm not saying you should, but if you do forget that part, then you just let the math go crazy on the data and produce something. Right?
yeah, so I mean, say 5 to 10 years from now, how do you probably would predict the future for quantum computing, and what are some of the breakthroughs in the future you are looking forward to?
Well, there's kind of a joke of sorts that for decades people always said that quantum computing was 10 years away. And we've
Yeah.
improved that. Now we always say it's 3 to 5 years away every year. Um, it's one of these things where you have certain expectations, and maybe the vendors, the providers don't hit them, but other things happen, right? It's not a straight line through this. Many different factors have to get improved, right? And sometimes when you make one much better, it lessens some of the other ones. The fundamental problem has to do with scalability, right? Small quantum computers are toys. There's just no other way of thinking about them. And you can say, well, they're early research prototypes. Yes, okay. But in comparison to actually using them in production, they're just cute, interesting toys. So scalability is important. And for scalability, we're not going to be able to rely on just these monolithic quantum processing units, right? That just get bigger and have millions of qubits. We're going to have smaller QPUs, quantum processing units, and we're going to have to network them in a quantum way. And depending on what your modality is, that is the type of qubit, whether you're superconducting, whether you're ions, whether you're atoms, whether you're diamond vacancy, the list goes on. The way you would do this networking would be different. Many of them would use some sort of optical connection. So you would take, let's say, a cold atom, a neutral atom, you would take a quantum state, somehow you would transduce it, right? That's the word, that quantum state onto a photon, and then you would move the photon someplace, and then you would transduce from the photon back into a quantum state somewhere. And in a perfect world, it would remain perfect, right? You wouldn't have any errors. So we must move to modularity. This is a requirement. And if this does not happen, we are going to be stuck with dozens of tiny, useless quantum computers. So that's the first thing. The other area that people talk about a lot is error correction, fault tolerance. And we discussed that a little bit earlier when we were talking about loading data for AI. That is, are there ways to fix the errors that happen in qubits as we go along? It's a much harder problem than classical. And the primary reason is that you cannot copy quantum data. For people who are new to quantum, this may seem very strange. I have quantum information stored in usually multiple qubits, and you say, hey, let's make a copy of that. I'd like to give one to you. No, I can't do it. I can teleport right? I can send my quantum data to you, but that destroys my copy. So I can't just make 9 copies of the data and send it, right? And then have some sort of majority rules win. And this completely changes the programming model. So quantum error correction is much harder. There's a lot of great research going on in that. You need a certain number of qubits to have one fully corrected logical qubit as error corrected qubit. Different people will give you different numbers, ranging from the dozens to hundreds to thousands, depending on how you do it. It's mostly research right now. So it's these two areas, scaling with via modularity and then error correction are the top two areas. I think it'll be by the end of the decade so that we start to see some glimpse of maybe these being put into production. I hope if we can see some breakthroughs on this modularity front in particular.
I mean, now the last and probably the very important question for the
Okay.
podcast, for the students who are watching this podcast, you are maybe pursuing a degree in computer science or physics or
Mm.
mathematics, and they wish to pursue a career in quantum computing. What sort of advice would you give as a senior researcher in the field?
And let me say, people have been asking me this question now for 7 years. And the answer 7 years ago was major in physics, minor in computer science. And the second part of my response, even then, was to say, but that will change over time so that you should major in computer science and minor in physics. So, right now, many of the jobs, right this moment, many of the jobs in quantum are related to the actual technology, right? So people who are optical engineers, right? Microwave engineers, people who can actually help build these quantum computers. There's some computer science. There are several companies that work on optimizing compilers, for example, for quantum. The use cases, there's been a lot of experimentation, but nobody is using them in production. Just remember that. So you're not going to come out as a computer software engineer, quantum software engineer, and suddenly get a job, right? We don't need that many right now because they're not going into production. In the very short term, I would lean toward the physics and the engineering still, but learn how to code. If you are relatively early in your career and you're planning to do a PhD, so that is, you probably have 5 or 6 years to go, I do think it would be reasonable to look at computer science. And then I would most likely recommend an area on compilers for quantum systems. Many people work on quantum algorithms, but we have to optimize what runs on them first, right? So you don't want to be one of 1,000 people who are doing useless algorithms. You want to be one of the exceptional people who help make the quantum computers useful sooner, right? So that's how it would go. And then in terms of math, well, I love math, and I think you can always do math, but no matter what happens, no matter what you major in, learn how to code. You know, Python is a great way. You don't have to pick a lot of other things, but whatever you want to do, learn how to code in Python really well. And that will give you at least the intellectual guidance for doing anything else.
Okay, okay. Thanks a lot for sharing your views and your experience with us today. And I myself have learned a couple of new things, at least some good directions for myself, at least. And thanks a lot for your time. And yeah.
My pleasure, and I'm happy to connect with people on LinkedIn. I'm Robert Sutor, and I mentor a lot of people. People ask me some of the same questions, so by all means, anyone who's watching this, please do connect with me. I can't necessarily give everyone an hour conversation, but I'm very happy to have asynchronous conversations to talk about quantum, the industry, education, whatever you'd like. And thank you for having me, Jay. I appreciate it.